event honors the life and the many contributions of Sarah Kramer, who meant so much to the life of this institution and dedicated so many years to sharing her passion for the visual arts. Tonight's lecture is supported by an endowed fund being established by Sarah's family and friends. We're grateful to the Rogers Foundation, the Melrose Foundation, and Wayne R. Kramer for their support of this fund. I also want to thank a group of people who helped plan and organize this event. Barbara Apking, Barbara Bernstein, Carl Gomberg, Dottie Cable, Wayne Kramer, and Stephen Wicks. A couple of people who are infinitely more qualified than I am will tell you more about Sarah in just a moment. First, let me just say how pleased we are at the KMA to kick off this important lecture series, which not only celebrates a great friend of the museum, but also supports the KMA's larger mission to connect people to the visual arts and to each other. We're truly honored. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, we'll hear for a moment first from Sarah's husband, Wayne Kramer, and from a longtime friend and colleague, Barbara Bernstein. Wayne.
Thank you, David, very much, and most importantly, thank all of you for being here tonight. As I remember the moment, it was sometime in the evening in either late 1979 or 1980, maybe early 1980, when Sarah, the joy and love of my life, and I first really discussed the Knoxville Museum of Art. I arrived home one evening to find Sarah particularly enthusiastic about her day and filled with an air of excitement and energy. She said to me, "Wayne, I think there may be an opportunity for me to work as an intern at the Knoxville Museum of Art with Flowery Levitt. I think it's a wonderful opportunity and I am really excited." I, in turn, raising what was no doubt an inappropriate pragmatic concern, asked of Sarah, "Will you be paid anything for this work?" Her response, with that bright smile and boundless enthusiasm, was, "No, I don't think so, but that doesn't really matter." She said, "The point is that it's an opportunity for me to share art with others, and that is what I love to do." And so began a professional journey for Sarah that took her to places that she could have never anticipated and enabled her to meet and interact with people that enriched her life in so many wonderful and meaningful ways. Many of you here tonight were part of that life here at the museum, from the Doolin House to the Candy Factory and now to this beautiful facility. For that, she was always grateful, and so am I. It was during those years that Sarah had an opportunity to grow with this museum and to literally reach out and touch hundreds of people, young and old, men and women, boys and girls, from all walks of life. She brought art to them, and they brought joy to her. Tonight is the first of the Sarah Jane Hardrath Kramer Lectures, a series of lectures which we hope and intend to bring to the museum each and every spring for years to come. It is a night to celebrate Sarah, her love for art, and for this museum. More importantly, it is my hope, and I know it would be Sarah's hope, that following this program, each one of you will leave here slightly more enthusiastic about art than when you arrived. If we accomplish that, not only on this night, but during lectures yet to come, it will be exactly what would have made Sarah happy. Sarah loved the arts and this museum with every ounce of energy that she had. I am glad that you were here to join with Russell and Reed. They're here in spirit. With Sarah's parents, her dear sister Sue, her husband Sam, and me, to celebrate art and all that it brings to people's lives. Scripture tells us that there is a time to mourn and a time to dance. Picture with me, as this evening progresses, Sarah's bright smile, her infectious enthusiasm for the arts and life in general, and consider this night a time to dance. There's a songwriter named Enya who plays beautiful music and sings beautiful songs. Many of you are no doubt familiar with her. Her songs were ones that Sarah often listened to when she was sick. In one of those songs, the words go like this: "Who has paced the midnight sky, so a spirit has to fly? As the heavens seem so far, now who will paint the midnight star? Place a name upon the night, one to set your heart alight, one to make the darkness bright, paint the sky with stars." I want to thank the Rogers Foundation, the Melrose Foundation, David Butler, and all those that are here and who are here and elsewhere who have helped make this evening possible, who were part of Sarah's life, and who will not only on this night, but in the years to come, enable Sarah's spirit to continue to paint the sky with stars in the world of art and at this museum which she so dearly loved.
I am a longtime board member of this museum and knew Sarah Hardrath Kramer in many different ways, most of them revolving around the Doolin Gallery and later the Knoxville Museum of Art. I knew her as a member of the staff, as my leader as I sat on her dynamic and effective education committee, later as a fellow trustee, and as a dear, dear friend. Sarah loved art in every way. She could express that love in perfect words as she taught and interpreted, and as she served the museum and the whole community as a constant advocate for art. She was so serious, so enthusiastic, so very lovely to work with, and I see people here who will agree with me. There was and always will be a Sarah following of her disciples at K&A. In 1997, Sarah retired from the staff as curator of education. The museum held a reception at that time in her honor, and I, as chairman of the board of trustees at that time, welcomed the crowd to our celebration. I found that I saved those words on my computer and decided that I would repeat them tonight just exactly as I wrote them 11 years ago. This event tonight, as advertised, is a Sarah celebration. If If anyone still wonders why I celebrate Sarah, I'll tell you. Part of the reason, of course, is to acknowledge 17 years of hard labor, her utter devotion, her long hours, her even longer after hours, her willingness to accept great responsibility added on in times of emergency. She will, however, tell you that it was the hard labor of love. She loved it. But more than the long service that we honor, I know all of us here are celebrating the radiant joy of Sarah. There was the joy of listening to her scholarly, inspiring, even spiritual descriptions of the art she brought to us. There was the joy in committee meetings of watching her organize chaos into order. And there is the supreme joy of being included in the bright, uplifting approval of her smile. I think I speak for all of us when I say thank you, Sarah, for the joyful time you have spent at KMA. I hope you have taught us how to carry on. The program tonight is proof that Sarah did teach all of us how to carry on.
Thank you so much. I mean, you really reminded me what this evening is about. I'm so honored to introduce Peter Morin as our speaker tonight. We thought long and hard about the person we would choose to kick off this series, and in the end, we chose someone whose achievements are listed in your program there. The most important is, which is sort of a track record of passion for the visual arts, particularly modern and contemporary art. That was most recently demonstrated in his long tenure as director of the Speed Museum in Louisville. Peter really understands how the visual arts fit into a community and how it requires the full support and participation of the community for the visual arts to flourish. So please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Peter Morin. Thank you.
I had the enormous privilege of working with Sarah on several occasions. I was curator of contemporary art at the High Museum in Atlanta, and she invited me up to lecture. I remember lecturing on the Cobra group of European painters. I came to judge shows, and she was really someone who was a delight to work with, someone who was truly on the side of life in every way, and someone who always made you feel good, always complimented you, always made you feel like you were far smarter than you actually were, at least in my case. Well, I'm going to talk tonight about something which I think sort of fits with who Sarah was as I knew her and remember her. I'm going to start with a quotation. I'm going to read it because I imagine some of you in the back can't see it. It says, "In order to advance with the moving reality, you must replace yourself within it. Install yourself within change, and you will grasp at once both change itself and successive states at which it might at any instant be immobilized. So install ourselves within change. Live in the present. Live in the early 21st century." God, that's hard. I mean, there's just about nothing harder, and I stand before you as somebody who does not own an iPod, whose wife does banking online, but I don't have a clue. So I think this is really, really hard. I forced myself to go through the automated checkout line at the grocery store, and it always takes 3 times as long as going with the actual human being. So installing ourselves within change, coming to terms with the time in which we live is a really tough task, and that's what I'm going to try and talk about, illustrating with some works of contemporary art, some that I love, some that I don't love, some that will might present some difficulties for some of you. Now, in the art world, we tend not to be terribly complimentary of the business world. But when we think about this incredible task of installing yourself within change, there are great models in the business world, like Jack Welch. I don't particularly agree with the subtitle on this title that says, "If leadership is an art, then surely Welch has proved himself a master painter." I wouldn't go that far. But this is a man who really installed himself within change. This was a guy who made a company move from a $1 billion a year company to a $12 billion a year company. This is a guy who changed the company from a good but somewhat sluggish performer to a company that grew 23% each year that he was, or on average when he was CEO. He inherited a company with 10 groups, 46 divisions, and 190 departments, subject to 43 different strategic plans, and he delayered the number of hierarchical levels from as many as 32 to as few as 4. He took GE out of businesses in which it was not number 1 or number 2 globally. I've got a GE Telecom clock here, collar, cufflink. Well, goodbye GE Color TV, goodbye GE Telecom clocks, goodbye GE toasters, goodbye GE fans. He moved into things like medical imaging. I mean, he did an incredible job, and he did it by changing the culture of his organization. He did it by globalization, something we'll see when we talk about contemporary art. He did it by the shift from manufacturing to service industries. He did it with something called Six Sigma, which was a drive to improve the quality of GE's businesses and programs. And then he did it with business on the internet. E-business initiative, rather, was called DestroyYourBusiness.com. The idea was that competition in the world was always going to get tougher, and you better refocus, reinvent your business before somebody else reinvented it for you. Welch said the impact of the internet was the biggest change I've ever seen, and he added, change means opportunity. So to have that positive attitude, to think about change meaning opportunity, rather than a pain in the neck, is what it means to install yourself within change. Now here's another guy who installed himself within change. This is James Breckenridge Speed, for whom the Speed Art Museum, where I worked for 21 years, is named, and his granddaughter, Alice Speedstall, who was a close friend, dear friend of mine, and all kinds of reasons for being fond of her. She left us $55 million when she died, so we liked her a lot. Well, James Breckenridge Speed installed himself within change. He's the person for whom, as I said, the museum's named. He initially made coal. He initially had a coal business, and he had a coal tipple that shook the coal as it got ready to be packed and taken on a horse cart out to people's houses. Well, that eliminated the coal dust. The Louisville Courier-Journal was very excited because this man was the first person with a coal tipple. He said, now without the coal dust, coal is a clean fuel. Everybody in Louisville should heat their house with coal. So this was a great step forward in that time. He also was the first person on a telephone in Louisville. He owned a telephone company. He had another forward business, which was streetcars. That was a go-ahead business at the time. He had also a cement plant. He founded the town of Speed, Indiana, in order to create cement and make concrete, because he realized that dressed stone was no longer the primary building material, that people were moving towards brick and towards concrete as a construction material. By faith, he was a Unitarian, which in the Louisville of the day put him on the outer radical fringe of the liberal element. Well, this great man, J.B. Speed, another person who installed himself within change, went to Paris in 1908. Just think about the art that he could have bought when he went to Paris in 1908. Monet. Monet spent part of the year in Venice, so all of those wonderful Venetian paintings of Monet's were available. Monet's water lilies. Water lilies were being painted each year, and so one of those fabulous paintings was available to J.B. Speed. He could have been adventurous and bought something like the wonderful Matisse La Désert, in which all the forms are tied together and the tablecloth becomes the wallpaper, and everything is knitted together with a repetition of forms in an extraordinary way. He could have visited Picasso. He could have bought the Demoiselle d'Avignon, which at that point was rolled up in a corner of Picasso's studio. He could have visited Rodin, who was very active, continued to be very, very active until his death in 1917. He could have bought a wonderful sculpture, that wonderful Tender Kiss by Brancusi, a young student of Rodin's. So what did J.B. Speed come home with? Bouguereau. Thanks a lot, J.B. I think what he did not realize was that painting had changed from something which primarily responded to the visual world, to the facts of appearance, to the facts of flesh and blood and three-dimensionality, to something which was an independent means of expression in and of itself. And what we have in this painting is a painting in which really the crust of the painting, the richness of the impasto or the paint on surface is as strong a reading as the description of the houses in Venice. And in fact, you don't really believe in the structural integrity of those houses in Venice. It's more as if they're like facades in a Western shoot 'em up or Blazing Saddles. You don't really have the substance. This is more painting that's not about description, but about a coloristic experience in and of itself. Well, when we think about art in the early 20th century, and Bouguereau had only died a couple of years before, so one can sort of forgive J.B. Speed. He was still the leading conservative painter whose reputation in Paris when J.B. Speed visited in 1908. When you think about that period, it really is a period of extraordinary richness, but a period in which art progresses in a more or less linear fashion. This is a diagram that Alfred Barr made in 1936, tracing the evolution really from post-impressionism right down to abstraction. From Alfred Barr's point of view, abstraction was a kind of evolution, something that came as a kind of progression of artistic means, and something he truly believed in. So as nutty as this diagram is, it's not really as nutty as it might at first seem. Today, with the cross-pollinization, the cross-fertilization of art all over the world, we couldn't even make a diagram as relatively clear as this one. So, I wanted to start with an image which kind of tells you about contemporary art. And the first lesson about contemporary art is one of geography. This is a photograph by Zhang Huan. Zhang Huan is a Chinese conceptual and performance artist. It's a 40 by 60-inch photograph, and it is entitled "To Add 1 Meter to an Anonymous Mountain." And so it's something that refers a little bit to the Chinese landscape painting tradition. It certainly refers to that pseudo-scientific attitude of conceptual art. It refers to the Chinese Communist government's discomfort with issues of sexuality. And it makes a statement which is ultimately kind of humorous, using human bodies instead of building materials, which would be a more typical conceptual or minimalist art tactic. Here's the point about this work of art. The work was first shown in Seattle, the year in which it was painted, next in Tel Aviv, then in Santiago de Compostela, next in Bern, Switzerland, and then back in Haifa, Israel, within 1 year of its completion by the artist. So we live in a completely international, global economy in the world of art. We are not like Alfred Barr, who only had to look at Western Europe. We have to look everywhere, all over the world. The acquisitions of the Speed Art Museum in recent years have been by Slovenian artists, Serbian artists, Swedish artists, Czech artists, Hungarian, Argentine, Mexican, South African, Egyptian. So we live in a world in which important art is being made everywhere. Here's another good lesson in the nature, the slippery, evasive nature of the contemporary art world. It's also a world which is made complicated by the art market. This is a painting by Yue Minjun. Yue Minjun painted this picture entitled Execution in 1995, the same year as Jean Huan's big photograph. It sold at auction on October 12, 2007 for $5,996,932. Not quite $6 million, $5,996,000. Yue only paints laughing figures, and all of his subjects are self-portraits, usually in his underpants. He's the leader of a Chinese movement called cynical realism. And he set this painting in Tiananmen Square. If you look closely, you can see that some of these laughing figures who are playing it, being executed, are standing on their tiptoes. There's a sense of occasion. There's also a sense of laughing at fate, or perhaps just pretending to laugh. Now, some people today question the universality of art and our ability to appreciate or come to terms with a work like this, which comes from such a different culture. And it certainly confounds our judgment to think that a work of importance would be made under Chinese communism. But it would appear, at least in this case, that market reform and getting rich have trumped communist ideals of collectivity and classless egalitarianism. Another good Asian artist. This is Takahashi Murakami. This time a Japanese. He's got a show opening on Saturday at the Brooklyn Museum. He's an artist who's very interested in Japanese anime cartoons. He's very interested in Japanese comic books, non-manga comic books. He makes no distinction between his commercial activities and his fine arts activities. In fact, there's going to be a Louis Vuitton shop in the middle of his exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum, selling handbags for between $1,000 and $2,000. He has two factories of employees, one in Tokyo and one in the Bronx. And several things, I think, do come together in his work. That swirl of paint that you see around this kind of monster recalls Hokusai's waves. It recalls Jackson Pollock's board paint. It recalls Roy Lichtenstein's refashioning of Pollock's board paint. It also refers to mutant creatures and is a reminder, perhaps, however cartoony as it may be, of the fact that Japan is the only country to have suffered an atomic bomb. He claims he's making art for the kawaii culture and the otaku culture. The kawaii culture are young Japanese girls who presumably have only two functions. One is to be cute and the other is to shop. And then the otakus are the young male counterparts, computer geeks, absorbed in obscure anime cartoon trivia. Not a very feminist conscious fellow. Another art in some ways in the same vein, Damien Hirst's sculpture called For the Love of God. It has, it's a diamond-encrusted skull. It has 8,601 diamonds on it. It's made out of 2,156 grams of platinum. It took 2 years to make. Mr. Hirst has it for sale for $100 million, 50 million pounds. He describes it as very light, very celebratory. He's also said it's a silly idea, and that's the only thing I really find redeeming about it. I think the notion that something could be that ridiculous and that expensive is kind of wonderful. It's a little like Christo doing very, very elaborate projects for a kind of gloriously absurd, momentarily beautiful gesture. Another artist in the same vein, Richard Prince, American. He has become fascinated with the Dodge Challenger car from 1970, and he pays to have these cars remade. The remaking of them costs $140,000. They're souped up so they can go faster than the original Dodge Challenger. And he puts them out at an edition of 3 and charges considerably more than $140,000 for it. And this one was shown at the Frieze Art Fair on a revolving turnstile, as if at a car fair with a model. People who visited the fair said, this is some kind of feminist statement, but I'm not exactly sure what. What it really was about the social and economic dynamics of the contemporary art world. So that brings me to this cartoon, and those of you in the back won't be able to read it, but what it says is, there's a painter standing in front of St. Peter, and he says, what about the redemptive power of my art? Won't you let me in on the basis of the fact that art has redemptive power? I think the Hearsts and the Princes and some of the Asian artists really call into question some of the things that I treasure about the art enterprise. The studio is replaced by the fabrication facility. The artist no longer goes into his studio to meditate, to commune with himself. Aesthetic decision-making is replaced by critical strategizing. Artist as sociologist, or artist as social theorist, or artist as Jack Welch. That might not be an altogether bad thing, but it's not altogether a good thing either. Loyalty to one medium, like I'm going to be a painter, is replaced by the most expedient means. And fine art in this world is no longer placed in opposition to commercial art. So we don't want to be, I mean, none of us want to be the guy who keeps GE and toasters and clocks, right? Instead of going into medical imaging technology. And nobody wants to be J.B. Speed coming in with his Bouguereau instead of his Picasso rolled up. But from a museum perspective, the problem, as I see it, is I try and navigate my way through an engagement with contemporary art. It's ultimately not one of theory or artistic practice, but one of quality. So my way, and this is a very personal lecture, is my way of coming to terms with contemporary art is in terms of questions about quality. One of the people very important to the theorists, Jacques Derrida, says questioning is the highest form of knowledge, and I've embraced that. If you think about these questions, they might not say what the most important contemporary art is, but at least gives you some kind of engagement. Puts you actively making decisions, actively deciding whether something is good or bad. First question is, does it extend the expressive range of art? Secondly, does it lead to a new way of seeing? Does it pose unanswerable questions, or does it create a new language of ornament? Is it disturbing? Is it provocative in a way that's not simply about novelty or technique? So, for example, George Siegel's sculpture, white plaster sculpture, a figure standing at a stoplight called Walk, Don't Walk, I think does lead to a new way of seeing. Every time after seeing that sculpture at the Whitney Museum, when I see people standing in the street waiting to cross, all of a sudden there's this more existential issue of whether you're going to go forward or stay where you are. There's also the fact that these are white plaster sculptures, so you can kind of imaginatively place yourself within those figures. There is something about that sculpture which enlarges my pleasure, human understanding, my looking at the world when I walk down the street, because I see things in terms of the Siegel. Life imitates art, in other words. Again, does it extend the expressive range of art? Does it lead to a new way of seeing? Yes. Here's an example of something that did not lead to a new way of seeing. This is a painting by Sandro Chia, and when his art first emerged in the early 1980s, people were so excited. This is a new humanism, this is a new way of depicting the human figure, this is a new heroicism. Here we have a woman clutching around the neck of a kind of classical warrior about to go off to battle, but ultimately it's just kind of overinflated. Reminds me of the Città Nuova outside of Rome, where these gigantic figures were set up by Mussolini in the 1930s, and they look overinflated and very empty at the same time. So not all new art succeeds. another set of questions. Does it create method for the expressive purpose the artist is focusing on? Is it the best example of artist's work available? That's the museum director's question. Does it complement existing strengths? That's another museum director's question. Is it beautiful? Can we house it? That's a museum director's question. Can we afford it? Of course we can. The board is going to pay for it. That's no problem. Is it an absolute object? By that I mean something which truly tells you about the time in which you live. Kenneth Clark said a masterpiece is something that is made by an artist who is deeply in touch with the age in which he lives, who has the genius to figure out a way to express those core issues. And Jackson Pollock's Autumn Rhythm, which was purchased by the Metropolitan Museum not long after it was created, is clearly one of those absolute objects, a case in which the artist wanted to portray line as pure velocity, an artist who wanted to make line which no longer described things in 3 dimensions, an incredible achievement. The story is told to me by, was told to me by Hyatt Mayer, who was curator, was at that meeting. The accessions committee voted it down. And the curator presenting it burst into tears. And so the accessions committee took pity on him and paid the $10,000 for this picture, which is the best investment the Metropolitan Museum ever made. And my friend Hyatt Mayer went up to him afterwards and said, you know, I'm so glad you got the painting. He said, yeah, the only problem is you can only cry once. So again, a work which does create method for the expressive purpose the artist is focused on. Great art doesn't have to be expensive. The Columbus Museum of Art in Columbus, Ohio, has just recently acquired a big collection of 1930s social realist painting, WPA paintings. And this is something that would be great for them. It's by an artist named Samuel Gropper, or William Gropper rather. It shows 2 railroad workers. It's for a sheet of music for the American Railway Union. If you see a hammer and sickle kind of slightly hidden in the upraised arm of the figure on the right with the pick, you would not be mistaken. Gropper was a communist in the 20s and 30s in America. But it's very strong, incisive drawing. It tells you a great deal about the socialist sympathies of American artists at that time. It's a $10 work of art. So great art does not have to be expensive, or art that fits within the context of a collecting program. This is one of my favorite purchases at the Speed Art Museum, and it answers all those questions. Is it disturbing? You bet it's disturbing. Does it create method for the artist's expressive purposes? Yes, it's made out of the leftover sand from iron castings, and this piece that she made with great labor, just kind of organically. She didn't have a plan before she made it. It failed, however, the question of can we house it, because it's 22 feet high, and ever since the Speed has paid enormous amounts to warehouse it every year off-site. But a great work of art in terms of that disturbing quality. And it did complement existing strengths because the Speed had a great sculpture collection. Now, I think one of the kinds of art which are so interesting right at the moment is craft. And I think craft is interesting because colored craftsmanship and decoration, I think, are the new subversive elements in contemporary art. Color is coming back. There are lots of exhibitions about color. Craftsmanship has not been a factor in contemporary art, at least as you see it with the biennials, for a long time. We've had a moratorium on decoration for 100 years, all of the 20th century. Basically turned its back on the idea of decoration. So decoration is new, it's subversive, it's radical, and one of the ways in which one sees that a lot is in terms of craft. This is a piece by Richard Marquis. And to me, it's spectacular. It's also something relatively new. The studio glass movement in the United States only goes back to 1962. And this is entitled Witch's Hat, but it reminds me of those hats that Chico Marx wore when he was playing Ciccolini in Day at the Races. Remember Tootsie Footsie ice cream? I remember, I don't know. But in any case, here's something that has, I think, extraordinary qualities. It's a work of art that, in my opinion, contrasts movement with stasis, grace with strength, determinacy with indeterminacy. You can't really follow those patterns on the surface. Comprehensibility with complexity. The pattern is very, very rich. And it's also humor. It's like Chico Marx. It's a kind of double agent. If you recall For and Against in that movie, well, Ciccolini's often, or Chico Marx is often a double agent, For and Against Groucho. But so there's a kind of, there's a quality to this, a kind of approach avoidance, in and out quality about this hat, which I think is, which is kind of extraordinary, made out of glass. Another, Tutzinski. It's a reminder that Tutzinski makes art out of glass fiber, that she invented with some engineers. And her colors are extraordinary. Her colors are not bronze. Her colors are more Kohlheim Stockhausen. Really extraordinary color, chromatic chords in these works. I think achingly beautiful. Also on the edge of being candy box sentimental. But she takes that risk, and I think that risk is extraordinary. This is a Windex bottle decorated with beads. Actually, it's not actually a Windex bottle underneath, but decorated with beads. It's by an artist named Liza Liu, who does a lot of things with beads. It's a kind of metaphor of sight. How do you see if the glass isn't clean? You gotta clean it, you gotta get the Windex. It's the iconic first object you see at the Toledo Museum of Art's new glass pavilion. And it answers the question that all the tour groups come in. This museum has a double glass wall, and all the tour groups come and say, well, how do you keep this place clean? Here's the Windex. But it's remade as a kind of magic totem. It's an incredibly bright, reflective, commanding work of art. This is an opposite work of art. No color or technical bravo. It's by Emma Woofenden. It's entitled Breath. It's a little bell jar, and she has breathed into that bell jar to capture her breath. And you have this. It's like a depiction of human life, a depiction of breath caught in one moment. These works raise a lot of questions. How does color or transparency convey meaning? What makes ornament transcendent? How does color, light, transparency, space, liquidity, and reflectivity of glass redefine abstraction or decoration? These are, I think, potent and powerful questions. Now I want to conclude here with one other artist, a ceramic artist. But again, here our issue is how works of art, in this case craft works, can rise to extraordinary profundity. And I think one of my strategies in dealing with the contemporary art world is to say, I'm not going to be interested in everything. I'm not going to look at photography. I'm not going to look at as vigorously as I look at some other fields. So I'm looking a lot, really relatively recently, at glass and ceramics. And Sachs answers, I think, some of my concerns. He uses all of those devices. Some of those other artists. Sachs is the one who did the ampersand vase. He uses those devices of the postmodernist appropriation, unlikely combinations. The artist is somebody who puts things together, or as the French would say, a bricoleur, somebody who combines high culture and low culture in recognition of the fact that we all live in a borderland today. We live in a borderland state. We're in between different places all the time. High tech, no tech, And it's really in contrast to the work of this potter from the 1950s, Maya Grotel, who found her expression in the act of potting. Her tradition was within the potting world itself and what the glaze did and how all that came together. You read M.C. Richards' Severing, the book, which was the book about pottery in the 50s and 60s. It was really a book which said that we're going to come to some higher spiritual state. We as craftspeople are going to live in the woods. We're going to come to a higher spiritual state because we're living authentically, honestly, and this is going to be reflected in our work. And it ain't necessarily so. Sachs lives in Los Angeles, and his work is very much influenced by Disneyland or Disney World. And I think his work is very evocative of something which you find at the entrance to Disneyland. It says, here you leave today and enter the world of yesterday, tomorrow, and fantasy. Well, what is the world of yesterday, tomorrow, and fantasy? It's everything except the here and now. It's everything except coming to terms with where we are right now. And your fellow Tennessean, Al Gore, would argue that this is a real problem, that we don't come to terms with where we are right now. So our friend starts with that idea that we live in a world of replicas. And here's the Matterhorn in the European Alps. There's a reproduction of the Matterhorn at Disneyland. There's a writer named Jean Baudrillard who sort of basically says we live more in a world of replicas than we live in a world of real things. And so it's a real struggle with coming to terms with the age in which we live. So Sachs makes ceramics which very interestingly evade any kind of grasp. They're sort of like Disneyland in terms of not being about the here and now. Here he shows some gritty clay, and on it he rests a chalice, which he calls a mortar bowl. Mortar bowl has a jagged edge like the sawtooth of a grinder of some kind, and so we can't drink from that chalice. The chalice gold surface resists touching. The surface below is in contrast to that, and the juncture between them is extraordinarily delicate. It's an object about being on display. It's not an object to touch, which is really something quite unusual for clay, because we think of clay as being the tactile art form. Another work by this extraordinary artist, Adrian Sachs. It's a covered jar on stand. On the top, there's a little antelope that he got at a flea market. It's a work which brings together opposites. The antelope finial, the little splash of gold, is an imitation of Roy Lichtenstein's imitation of Jackson Pollock, or de Kooning's swirls of paint. The shape comes from a Buddhist temple, a reminder that Los Angeles is a Pacific Rim town. So a work of art which expresses a sense of the artist here and now. Here another one. It's titled Home Team Advantage, and he uses these Rococo handles and Rococo shapes. There's no art form more alien to early 21st century America than French Rococo. It's the fluffiest art form there is. It's nothing anywhere that any of us come to terms with comfortably. It is the most alien art form, and he appropriates it for the handle and the shape of this vessel, and then he even imitates it in the shape of the wall of clay beneath. On top, he has a figure of a baseball player whose leg repeats the shape of the spout of this vessel. You can't see it probably from the background, but he also holds a machine gun. So home team advantage may be something sort of sinister. Here, another work which is a meditation on those 18th century French predecessors. This ewer the shape of an eggplant with its gold trim clearly is reminiscent of the Rococo French work of the mid-18th century, but also the fact that the 18th century French liked to take Chinese vessels and put ormolu gold mounts upon them. So that, again, this idea of mixing together different worlds, bringing things together that normally don't fit at all. It's that sense of keeping these things in tension, making you think about all these funny things coming together that I think makes him a great artist. He clearly comes out of Los Angeles, clearly expresses that sense that we're in this strange borderland, which Los Angeles is. Los Angeles always seems to me like it's part of a Latin American republic. It never really seems to me like it's part of the United States. I don't know if the rest of you have that experience or not. Finally, the ampersand vessel, again, he's taken an existing shape, the way whereas Jasper Johns might have taken targets or flags. He adds a little cactus finial on top and an ormolu French Rococo handle. It's a disturbing object. It's a disturbing object in a way that continues to provoke at least me and ask questions. I think we're in a very, very interesting moment in which fields like craft, which have not previously been thought of, places where one encounters the great questions that are propelling contemporary art forward. I think we're now in a state in which we can find those great questions propelling contemporary art forward in fields like glass and ceramics. So, again, I'm asking about the work of Adrian Sachs. Does it extend the expressive range of art? Yes, certainly in terms of these strange things it brings together. Does it lead to a new way of seeing? Yes, it's kind of funny there, but not there, quality of his work. I think it poses unanswerable questions. Certainly it has a new language of ornament in the way in which it's addressing the Rococo. Is it disturbing? Yeah, it's really weird. That's a good thing. Contemporary art should be disturbing. And is it provocative in a way that is not simply about novelty or technique? That gets to a really interesting question, and that is what constitutes authenticity in contemporary art? What constitutes a work of art that is not subsumed by the art market? Or is it okay to be subsumed by the art market if that's the artist's expressive purpose or expressive need? So, what is the hardest job we all have? We have a lot of hard jobs in our lives. And let's go back to Sarah for a second, because I think she was somebody who truly lived in the moment, truly lived in the here and now. And one of the hardest jobs we have is living in the present day. This is a photograph from House and Garden of a characteristic New York apartment with early 19th century furniture and 19th century style bed and 18th century pattern quilt on top of the bed. Truly, if most of us lived in a way that was consistent with our home furnishings, we would never get into an internal combustion machine automobile and drive anywhere. We'd never turn on an electric light. Most of us do not live in a way that is consistent, or do not choose in our home furnishings. We like a homeliness. That's not the right word. A hominess. A hominess that is comfortable for us to live in. So we live in a contrast. So we do have that problem. How do we come to terms with living in the 20th century, 21st century? I urge you to install yourself within change, and I urge you to be engaged with contemporary art. Certainly here at the Knoxville Museum of Art is a good place to do it. To be engaged, to install yourself within change. Wrestling with the issues of contemporary art is a great way to do it. Thank you all so much.